In 2021, a team of geneticists at Trinity College Dublin and Kanazawa University did something that had never been done at this depth before. They read the complete genomes of 12 people who had been dead for thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers, rice farmers, and the subjects of an ancient empire, all recovered from the soil of the Japanese islands. For nearly a century, the question of where the Japanese came from had an answer, a clean answer. Two peoples, one story, settled science. But when the results came back from those 12 ancient skeletons, the data carried something the old story had no room for at all. Something that had been hiding, unnoticed, for 1,700 years. This is the story of who the Japanese actually are. And it is not the story that most people, including most Japanese, grew up believing. The old answer went like this. Long ago, an ancient people lived on the islands, alone. Later, a second people arrived from the mainland, bringing rice. The two mixed across the centuries, and their blend became the modern Japanese. Two ancestors, one a native, one a newcomer. It was elegant, it fit the archaeology, and for decades it was simply the truth. The problem was that the 12 genomes didn't add up to 2. When the geneticists measured the ancestry of living Japanese people against these ancient bones, a third signature kept surfacing, a whole ancestral component that neither of the two known peoples could account for. And the strangest part wasn't that it existed, it was when it arrived, and how much of the modern population it turned out to explain. By the end of this, you'll see why the idea of a single, pure origin, for the Japanese, or for any people anywhere on Earth, is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in all of human history. If that's the kind of thing you find worth an hour of your curiosity, consider subscribing. Then let's go back to the beginning, long before Japan was Japan. To understand why 12 skeletons could unsettle a century of consensus, we first need to understand what the geneticists were actually reading, and the model they were reading it against. Start with a fact that sounds almost too simple to matter. Every human being alive shares roughly 99.9% of their DNA with every other human being. We are, genetically, an astonishingly young and uniform species. Nearly all of us descended from small populations that walked out of Africa within the last 100,000 years or so. The whole story of ancestry lives inside that final sliver of difference. As groups of humans spread across the planet and stayed partly separated for thousands of years, tiny variations accumulated in their DNA. Not better, not worse, just different. The whole of that difference, everything that distinguishes any one population from any other, is packed into a fraction of the genome. Ancestry is not a matter of different kinds of humans. It is a matter of which particular combinations of the same shared variation a group happened to carry, shaped by where their forebears lived and whom they lived among. Here is the useful way to picture what the scientists do with that difference. Think of a population's genome as a river. The water in that river didn't come from one place. It was fed by different tributaries far upstream, each carrying its own distinct sediment. And if you know what to look for, you can sample the river and estimate how much of its water came from each source. That is what ancient DNA makes possible. By reading the genomes of the people who lived upstream in time, scientists can sample the tributaries directly, and then work out how they combine to make the river we see today. That sampling is far harder than it sounds. Ancient DNA does not survive the centuries intact. It breaks into short, chemically damaged fragments, mixed together with the DNA of soil, of bacteria, of everyone who has handled the bones across the years. Recovering a full, readable genome from a body thousands of years old is painstaking work, and for most of the history of this question, it simply could not be done well enough to settle it. That is what had finally changed. Once the team held those 12 genomes in hand, they could place each ancient individual onto a kind of genetic map. A chart where people who share more ancestry sit closer, together, and strangers drift apart. Where each of those ancient skeletons landed on that map would decide everything. For most of the 20th century, The river that is the Japanese population was said to have two sources. The idea even had a formal name, the dual structure model, proposed by the anthropologist Kazuo Hanihara in 1991. And it did not begin with DNA at all. It was built decades before anyone could read an ancient genome from bones. Anthropologists had long noticed that ancient Jomon skeletons and later Japanese skeletons differed in consistent ways, in the shape of the skull, the set of the teeth, the proportions of the face. The simplest explanation was two populations, an older native stock and a later arriving stock that blended into it. Hanihara gathered that reasoning into one clear framework, and it became the reigning account of Japanese origins for a generation. Its logic was elegant, and to see why it held for so long, you have to meet the first of those two sources. They are called the Jomon, and they were among the most remarkable hunter-gatherers who ever lived. They settled the Japanese islands more than 15,000 years ago and stayed largely undisturbed for over 10,000. They built some of the earliest known pottery anywhere on Earth, cord-marked clay vessels made long before most of the world had farms or cities. They lived in settled villages while remaining foragers, fishers, and gatherers, which almost no other people on Earth managed. Some of their pottery stretches back perhaps 16,000 years, among the oldest ever found, and some of it is extraordinary. Elaborate flame-shaped vessels with rims that rise like tongues of fire, shaped by people who had no writing, no metal, and no farms. For over 10,000 years they endured, through changing climates and shifting coastlines, without ever taking up agriculture. In a world where settled life almost always meant crops, the Jomon were a profound exception. A people who put down deep roots on the strength of a rich sea and a generous forest alone. And crucially, they were alone. Cooke's team found that the Jomon had split away from mainland Asian populations sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, right as the rising seas at the end of the last ice age drowned the land bridges and turned the region into a chain of islands. Cut off from the continent, the Jomon became a genetic world unto themselves. And the scale of that isolation is startling. Across those thousands of years, the study estimated the Jomon sustained an effective population of only around 1,000 people. 1,000 for millennia. So small, so separated, and so distinct that in the genetic data, every ancient Jomon individual clusters tightly together, set apart from every other population sampled, ancient or modern, anywhere on the planet. That figure, an effective population of about 1,000, needs a word of care, because it does not mean only 1,000 Jomon were ever alive at once. It is a geneticist's measure of how much genetic variety a population carries. A low number means a small, tightly interbred group with little fresh blood arriving from outside. For the Jomon, sealed off on their islands, that is exactly what the isolation produced. A few of the individuals in this line of research are known well enough to have names in the literature. A Jomon woman recovered from Funadomari on the far northern island of Ribun, and another from Ikawazu on the mainland coast. Read thousands of years after their deaths, their genomes still fall into that same lonely cluster, apart from all the world. For a long time, the Jomon were understood as the deep foundation of the Japanese, the native bedrock. But a foundation needs something built on top of it, and around 3,000 years ago, something arrived. We call them the Yayoi, after the district in Tokyo where the first traces of their culture were unearthed. And they carried with them a technology that would remake the islands completely: wet rice farming. Cooke's team confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected. The people who introduced rice cultivation to Japan carried Northeast Asian ancestry, a genetic signature from the continent that the isolated Jomon simply did not have. They most likely arrived by way of the Korean peninsula, and they came with a way of feeding far more people from far less land. The genetic trail runs further back still. The Northeast Asian ancestry the Yayoi carried resembles that of ancient populations from around the Amur River basin, in the cold, far northeast of the continent. Groups that had drifted south and east over many generations before ever reaching the sea. They came in force from around 3,000 years ago, in the centuries leading toward 900 BCE, and they did not bring only rice. They brought bronze and iron, new tools and new weapons, and a whole new way of organizing a life around a paddy field and a harvest. Think about what that means for a moment. Farming does not just change a diet. It changes how many children survive, how densely a settlement can grow, how quickly one people can expand into the space of another. Wherever agriculture spread across the ancient world, the farmers usually did not simply teach their neighbors. They out-multiplied them. Rice paddies could support populations that a foraging landscape never could, and so the balance on the islands began to tip. Across the archipelago, over centuries, the encounter played out the way such encounters usually do. Some Jomon were absorbed into the growing farming communities. Some were pushed to the margins, to the mountains and the far north and the far south. And some simply left fewer and fewer descendants as the paddy-fed villages swelled around them. And so the two-part story took its final shape. The ancient Jomon and the incoming Yayoi farmers. Native and newcomer. Mix them together across 2,000 years and you arrive at the modern Japanese. This was the dual structure model, and by every measure available in the 20th century, it worked. It matched the skulls, it matched the pottery, it matched the spread of rice. There was no obvious reason to doubt it, but even this wasn't the full story. Because when Cooke's team examined the genomes from the era that came after the Yayoi, the age when Japan was becoming an empire, the arithmetic broke. The period is called the Kofun, named for the enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds its rulers raised across the landscape. It runs from roughly the 3rd century into the 6th century of the Common Era, a time when the scattered communities of the islands were consolidating into something like a unified state, with an imperial court, ranked social classes, and monuments built on a scale never seen there before. One of those monuments, the tomb attributed to the Emperor Nintoku, covers more ground than almost any tomb ever built by any civilization on Earth. A moated keyhole of piled earth so vast you cannot even perceive its shape from the ground. This was a society announcing its own power in soil and stone. This was supposed to be a period of state building, not of new blood. By the Kofun era, the genetic mixing was assumed to be long finished. Jomon plus Yayoi sealed. But the 3 individuals Cooke's team sequenced from the Kofun period told a different story. They carried a substantial dose of an ancestral component that neither the Jomon nor the early Yayoi could supply. One that matched the ancient populations of the East Asian mainland around the Yellow River, the agricultural heartland of Han Chinese civilization. When the team tried to model living Japanese people as a simple blend of just Jomon and Yayoi, the model refused to fit. Something was always missing. Only when they added this 3rd, mainland source did the numbers finally settle into place. And on that genetic map, the Kofun individuals no longer sat beside the Jomon and the Yayoi at all. They had drifted decisively toward the peoples of the Yellow River, far across the sea. A 3rd source, arriving late, during recorded proto-history, not deep prehistory. A migration the dual structure model had left no room for at all. And here is where it becomes genuinely surprising. When Cooke's team measured how much each of these 3 sources contributes to modern mainland Japanese people, they did not find 3 tidy equal thirds. They found that the Jomon, the ancient, foundational, 10,000-year people, account for only about 13% of modern ancestry. The Yayoi farmers, roughly 16%, and the latecomers, that East Asian source arriving in the Kofun age, around 71%. The single largest ancestral component of the modern Japanese population arrived last. Not with the first settlers, not with the farmers who brought rice, but during the age of emperors and great tombs, a time when nearly everyone had assumed the story was already written. To put the scale of that in perspective, for most of the last century, if you had asked who the ancestors of the Japanese were, these Kofun-era migrants would barely have registered. A late ripple on an old story, if they were mentioned at all. Yet on the evidence of these genomes, they turn out to be the majority. More of the modern Japanese genome traces back to that final wave than to the ancient Jomon and the rice-bringing Yayoi combined, several times over. It is worth sitting with the human picture behind that number, because a percentage on a chart can hide an entire world. The Kofun era was a time of intense contact with the mainland. As the islands organized into a state, they pulled in people and skills from across the sea. Metalworkers, potters, weavers, scribes, horse handlers, and the administrators a young kingdom needs. Japanese histories set down centuries later still remembered these continental arrivals. The immigrant clans who brought record-keeping, new crafts, and new learning to the court. Around the great tombs themselves, artisans set out haniwa, hollow clay figures of warriors, horses, houses, and attendants standing over the dead in their thousands. It was a civilization borrowing openly from the mainland, even as it raised monuments to its own kings. Writing came, new crafts came. Later, so would Buddhism. This was not a sudden conquest with a single date on it. It was a long, sustained flow of people arriving over generations, drawn toward a rising power. And quietly, they reshaped the ancestry of an entire nation while its rulers were busy building tombs. Now, a word of honesty, because on this channel it matters. Those 3% are estimates, not commandments carved in stone. Cooke's team worked from only 2 Yayoi genomes and 3 from the Kofun, and later research has pushed and pulled at the exact figures. Some studies suggest the Yayoi contribution may be larger and the Kofun share smaller than this first estimate implied. What is held up firmly is the shape of the finding, not the precise arithmetic. 3 sources, not 2. That core result has been supported again and again. The exact proportions are still being refined, and that is not a flaw in the science. That is the science working the way it is supposed to. The mixture is not even uniform across the islands. In the Ryukyu Islands to the south, Okinawa and its neighbors, people carry noticeably more Jomon ancestry than mainland Japanese do. And the Ainu, the indigenous people of the far northern island of Hokkaido, carry more still. They are, in a real genetic sense, the closest living link to the ancient Jomon world. The same river, it turns out, branched differently in different places, leaving more of the old water in some channels than in others. It is a strange kind of survival. A people can be outnumbered many times over, folded into a far larger population, and still never truly disappear, because their DNA keeps traveling forward, generation after generation, carried in bodies that no longer remember where it came from. The Jomon lost their world, but their water still runs in the river. So step back and take in the whole shape of it. The people we call the Japanese are not the product of one origin, or even 2. They are the meeting of 3 distinct human streams. A hunter-gatherer people isolated for 10,000 years, a farming people who crossed the sea with rice, and a mainland people who arrived in the age of emperors, braided together, over time, into a single population. And there is something quietly profound hidden inside those 3 numbers. The people who were there first, the Jomon, who held the islands alone for 10 millennia, are today the thinnest of the 3 currents. And the widest current of all belongs to people who arrived so late they were almost contemporaries of written history. The deepest root is the smallest share. The newest arrival is the largest. If you have ever taken one of those consumer DNA tests and stared at a breakdown that didn't match the story your family always told, a percentage from somewhere unexpected, a sliver you could not place, This is the very shape of what you were looking at. No population on Earth is a single, clean line. Every one of them is a confluence. And the deeper anyone looks, the more sources they find waiting upstream. The Japanese are not unusual in this. They are simply unusually well studied. One of the few peoples whose deep origins have now been read directly from the bodies of the ancestors themselves. Do the same for any nation on Earth, and you would find the same kind of answer. Not a line, but a gathering of streams, most of them older and stranger than anyone raised on a tidy national story would ever expect. This is also the part worth being careful about, because it is the part most often twisted into something it is not. The tripartite origin of the Japanese is not a ranking. It is not a story about which ancestor was purer or stronger or more truly Japanese than the others. None of these three peoples was more original than the rest. The so-called native Jomon were themselves the descendants of still earlier migrations, humans who had walked out of Africa and across the whole breadth of Asia to reach those islands. Go back far enough, and everyone, everywhere, is a newcomer somewhere. What the Japanese genome actually records is not a bloodline running back to a single well. It is a braided river. 3 currents that ran separately for thousands of years, then joined, and now move together as one. You cannot lift a single drop from that river and call it the true source. There is no one source. There is only the confluence. And consider what nearly happened to the oldest of those currents. The Jomon, that small, isolated people of perhaps 1,000 souls, cut off on their islands for 10,000 years, could so easily have vanished from the story altogether. They did not vanish. Their signature endures, quietly, in every modern Japanese person, and most of all in the Ainu and the people of the Ryukyus. A lineage that was absorbed, not erased, carried forward, not lost. That, in the end, is what these 12 ancient genomes really tell us. Not simply who is Japanese, but how any people is made. Never from a single source. Always from the meeting of many. 3 peoples, 1 river. Not a line running back to a single beginning, but a web reaching outward to many. So the next time someone speaks of a pure origin, for any people anywhere, remember the 12 skeletons and the 3rd stream that stayed hidden for 1,700 years. If this changed the shape of something you thought you understood, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another current to follow.